Hello, my name is Simon McEnteggart, and I'm an assistant professor of film at the University of Utah Asia campus based in Songdo, Incheon, South Korea. And today I'm going to be talking about director Park Nam-ok, Korea's first female film director, and her incredible achievements in Korean cinema history, as well as the amazing legacy that she left behind for female filmmakers who came after her. So let's begin. Now, director Park Nam-mok's early years are really fascinating to talk about. She was born in 1923 in Hayang, North Gyeongsang Province, and of course that was a time of Japanese occupation. So an extremely difficult period in Korean history, of course, and a lot of people throughout the peninsula suffered greatly. Director Park Nam-mok herself was the third daughter of 10 children within her particular family. So a very, very large family, which was not uncommon at that time. However, director Park Nam-mok's family was quite fortunate compared to others in that her father was a quite successful merchant. So the family was relatively comfortable financially. And the reason why this is important is because it meant that director Park Nam-mok and her siblings could have an education. And that's something that unfortunately not many families could claim at that time. And if you read director Park Chan-mok's autobiography, you can see that she, from a very young age, she was very tenacious, with a real drive and desire to study as much as possible, particularly when it came to art and movies. Director Park Chan-mok's intense desire to study eventually culminated in attending Ewha Women's University, where she studied home economics. Unfortunately, during that period, not many majors were available to female students, and director Park Nam-mok unfortunately had no choice but to study home economics. And again, if you read her autobiography, she wasn't particularly happy with this experience because her focus really was in the art world, the film world. So ultimately, she left before completing her studies, which in itself is quite interesting because not many people during that period can afford an education, let alone decide to quit before completing studies. So it really shows just how determined she was to follow her passion for art. As her life continued, director Park Nam-mok made various acquaintances in the art and the film worlds. And through one particular acquaintance, director Park Nam-mok became connected to the Joseon Film Company, the most prominent film company in Korea at that time, where she managed to meet a lot of prominent filmmakers who were doing their best to make film during such a difficult period in Korean history. And one of the people that she was able to meet was her idol, actress Kim Shin-jae, who actually was director Park Nam-mok's inspiration for why she wanted to make film in the first place. And also director Chae In-gyu, who you may know from directing Hurrah for Freedom or Jayu-manse. So a very prominent director during that period. So as well as meeting all of these incredible filmmakers during that time, director Park Nam-mok also got the opportunity to work on the set of A New Oath, Seoul Mengso, in 1947. And if you look on the right in the middle, you can see a picture of her on set, helping the cinematography team and taking notes. This was also a film that starred Chae Eun-hee in one of her early roles. And of course, she would go on to become one of the most prominent actresses of the 60s and also a film director in her own right. So during the Korean War, of course, families throughout the peninsula suffered greatly. And director Park Nam-mok's family was no exception to this. Although she was quite fortunate because during the war, director Park Nam-mok actually got a job with a film crew, working to create newsreels and also to edit the newsreels themselves for the Ministry of National Defense. So despite the incredible hardship of the era, director Park Nam-mok was still able to work on some kind of film during that particular period. And once the war had finished, she was introduced to screenwriter Lee Bora, and they were married and shortly thereafter had a child. And they decided that together they were going to produce a film about the war widows of the period, because there were so many war widows following the Korean War, and their story was not really being told. So Ibora wrote the script, and director Park Nam-mok, of course, took the director's chair, and they decided to make The Widow. But of course, this was 1954, shortly after the Korean War had ended. So making any sort of feature film was incredibly difficult. And one of the main issues, of course, for making a film at that time was money. So obtaining the budget was very, very difficult. But fortunately for director Park Nam-ok, her older sister offered to give her a loan. And due to this relationship, they decided to create sister productions or jame productions, just to show just how close their relationship was. Unfortunately, that money often ran out during filming. So frequently during the actual shooting process of the film, director Park Nam-ok had to return home, firstly to get some rest because she was very tired, but also to ask her family for some additional financial help. And she was very fortunate that they were willing to do that. So it's very interesting to see how director Park Nam-ok and her sister and family came together to help her to make this film. However, budgetary constraints were a problem throughout the entire process because due to the limited budget, directing, catering, and parental duties were all handled by director Park Nam-ok herself, which is really difficult to imagine. It's truly incredible because directing a feature film in itself is an enormous task. But to do so with a relatively newborn baby on your back at the same time is incredibly difficult. But then when money ran out and started to get lower, director Park Nam-ok then had to go to the early morning markets to buy groceries, vegetables, and things like that in order to prepare the lunches and meals for the cast and crew during the day. So that's pretty much three full-time jobs that director Park Nam-ok had to do at the same time as trying to make her feature film debut, which really shows just how incredibly determined and how single-minded she was in finishing the film to the best of her ability and not letting anything stand in her way. Completing the film was, of course, extremely difficult, but following the completion, the post-production process also presented challenges that she had to overcome. One of those, of course, was editing. So director Park Nam-ok had to hire out a hanok house where she and fellow crew members would sit, and during this very cold winter, they would edit the film and put it all together. However, as the winter was so harsh, director Park Nam-ok's child became very, very sick. And so she had to rush to a hospital in order to get treatment for her child. So again, we're seeing a mixture here of parental duties and filmmaking duties, and just how difficult and complex and stressful that must have been for her at that time. Following the completion of editing, director Park Nam-ok had what she claims in her autobiography to be the first real instance of sexism and discrimination when she tried to get the sound recording and sound mixing for her film completed. She repeatedly went to the building where the sound recording equipment was, but was repeatedly turned away. And after having this situation play out several times, she was finally told the reason, which was that if a woman director used the equipment in that building at the beginning of the year, then that would mean bad luck for anyone else using that equipment and that building for the rest of the year, which of course is incredibly sexist, but unfortunately was a feature of the period. And director Park Nam-ok, of course, was very, very upset about this. And fortunately, through an acquaintance, she managed to get the sound recording done well. However, problems unfortunately didn't end there either. So even after the film was actually completed, and even though it was well received by critics of the time, due to the lack of distribution infrastructure during that particular time period, The Widow was not commercially successful. There simply were not enough cinema screens, there was not any sort of distribution network, and director Park Nam-ok had to personally herself go and visit cinema screens in order to make deals with the managers and the operators. In one particular instance in her autobiography, she mentions meeting a man from her hometown who she entrusted with a sum of money to get The Widow into cinema screens in a particular region, and unfortunately the man ran away with the money. So it was constant battling from beginning to end for director Park Nam-ok. And it's truly incredible that she actually managed to finish the film at all, but it also must have been truly heartbreaking to see the film be not commercially successful at that time. So I've been talking about the film for a while and about how difficult it was to make the film. So now let's have a look at the film itself. We're going to now look at one of the most interesting scenes from the film where our widow, Shinja, has a conversation with her love interest, Tech, about their future. So let's have a look at a clip from The Widow.
뭐야 생각하는 게? 응?
Yeah. Yeah.
예, 송소박내가 이사 가면 그리로 보낼까? 나도 귀찮아.
걔가 간대?
내가 구슬 낼게. 엄마!
So a truly touching scene there from very classic melodrama. So there's a very powerful scene that reveals a lot of the issues that are expressed within the film, and let's talk about those in detail now. So The Widow really did push boundaries for that particular era in several different ways. And one of those ways was the way that the après girl was expressed. Now, as Professor Klein discusses, the après girl was assertive rather than selfless, sexually bold rather than chaste, and active in public rather than sequestered in the home. Now, the après girl was a very interesting character within Korean cinema and generally in Korean media at that particular time, because it showed a new type of Korean woman, a new Korean woman, someone who rejected the older Confucian style ideas of how women should behave in society. And a lot of that was based on the influence of Western culture due to after the war, the opportunities for women in the workplace, as so many men unfortunately did not return home. And there was a lot of independence and individuality and freedom that women could enjoy during that period, much more compared to previous generations. However, if you look at a lot of films during this particular period, especially with director Han Kyung-mo's films, the après girl was often a very controversial figure, someone who took their independence too far, They were often juxtaposed with a pure-hearted traditional Korean woman dressed in hanbok, while the après girl had Western-style clothing, was a bit more selfish, more independent, and it was used almost like a morality tale when it came to say, ladies in Korea, this is how you should behave. However, in The Widow, we don't get that particular situation. Our lead character, Shinja, is a very independent woman. She's a widow. She asks her deceased husband's friend for money, and she doesn't do it with the intention to pay him back in an alternative way. She just asks for a loan, which she then uses to create her own business. She has a love interest who she's not afraid to actually pursue. And interestingly, she doesn't have a contrast with a pure-hearted traditional Korean woman in a hanbok. Instead, she's actually juxtaposed with the various different types of women and their difficult situations during that period. One of whom is a married woman who is seeking an extramarital affair. Another lady who lives nearby is a prostitute. And none of them are presented negatively. None of them are really showed in a bad way. They are simply women trying to survive as best as they can. So what we have here is an après girl who is being shown to be simply an independent woman who is not punished or is not being amoral within the narrative itself. Also, we get to see Shinja as a mother character who is resisting certain motherhood stereotypes. Shinja is a character who really expresses the social realities of the period, and that in itself is incredibly interesting. A lot of the melodramas that appeared in the 50s and 60s generally focused on the middle and upper classes. Rarely do we get to see a mother who is poverty-stricken with a sense of social realism. So that's a really interesting way of depicting the reality of the time. A lot of people went to the cinema in order to escape their social reality because post-war Korea was such a challenging environment to live in, particularly Seoul, of course, as it was largely destroyed. But director Park Nam-ok used social realism and features of the melodrama in order to resist motherhood stereotypes, what Ian Kaplan refers to as a resistant maternal woman's film. So the way in which Shinja as a character resists motherhood stereotypes is that she's not sacrificing her identity. She's not sacrificing her desires, sexual or in terms of career as a woman, in order to become purely a mother. She is very much interested in developing a career, developing a business, pursuing the man that she likes. So she's actually trying to negotiate all of these different worlds as well as be a mother towards her daughter Ju. However, of course, in the film, Shinja actually chooses her love interest Taek over her daughter, but she does so in a very interesting way. She puts Ju with her next door neighbor. So in this sense, she can have both the best of both worlds. She can pursue her love interest Taek and also see her daughter Ju regularly. Now, this is very interesting because this totally goes against the Confucian older ideas of what Korean mothers should be. So it's very progressive in this sense. Another main area that definitely needs to be discussed is that Shinja pursues sexual desire and is not punished for it. If we look at a lot of films from the period, particularly Madame Freedom, Jayu-buin, which is the most famous film in post-war Korea, I think it's safe to say, the characters within these films, these melodramas, they often seek their independence. They seek their sexual desires. And often during the course of the narrative, these characters are punished in some way. Either their actions are conveyed as amoral, and then something happens to them, or Korean society or their families go against them in some way. So at the end of Madame Freedom, for example, Madame O is kicked out of the house for pursuing her independence and sexual desires. And this was a common feature through a lot of films. However, with The Widow, we do not see this. Shinja actively pursues sexual desire with Taek. She wants a future relationship with him. And at the end of the film, sadly, Taek is reunited with his first love, who he believed died during the war. And then Taek and Shinja have to break up. And while the end of the film is tragically lost, if you look at director Park Chan-wook's autobiography, it's suggested that Shinja is reunited with Joo and they walk off into the sunset together to start their life anew. Now, this is not a form of punishment that we typically see during that period. If you look at any of the other films that show après girls or women who go against Confucian ideals, they often do get punished in some way, and occasionally physically as well. But Shinja does not have that experience. So that is why Shinja as a character is really fascinating, because she is a stark contrast to other female protagonists of post-war Korean cinema and Golden Age Korean cinema in general. Now, many years passed, and it was believed that The Widow had been lost to time, sadly. However, in 1997, the first Seoul Women's International Film Festival was launched, and professor and filmmaker Kim So-young was one of the committee tasked with launching the Seoul Women's Film Festival. And she really wanted The Widow to be the first film played at the festival. It seemed only right, it seemed only fitting. So Professor Kim So-young contacted the Korean Film Archive just to see if somewhere in their warehouses, in all of the films that they had acquired, if The Widow was still there. And amazingly, it was. And this was a really big surprise to everyone, particularly to director Park Chan-wook herself, because she had believed that the film had been destroyed. She thought there was one copy left in existence that had been destroyed in a house fire. And so it was really amazing that the film actually still existed. And a lot of people were very, very excited to have the film screened as the first film at the first Seoul Women's International Film Festival. So what the festival did was to send someone to Los Angeles, because director Park Chan-wook had moved there in the 80s. And they went to LA, met with director Park Chan-wook, and asked her to return to Korea and introduce The Widow to the audience at the festival. And according to director Park Chan-wook's daughter, when she was asked to return, director Park Chan-wook replied, "I have nothing to wear," which is a very interesting reply. And of course, we can only imagine what director Park Chan-wook was feeling at that time. But it's probably safe to imagine that she had a lot of complex feelings about the film itself. She had worked so hard to create this film, only to see it then become a not exactly a commercial success that she wanted, which actually resulted in director Park Chan-wook being saddled with a lot of debt, which she had to pay off in the following years. So we can imagine there's a lot of complex emotional feelings regarding the film, which is why she replied in this way. But fortunately, director Park Chan-wook's daughter returned to Seoul to introduce the film to audiences at the time. And work on the film hasn't stopped there. The Korean Film Archive is actually currently working to restore The Widow for modern audiences. They are running the original negative through a lot of their machines. They are working to readjust the sound levels to get the color correction just right as to how it was back in the day. And that work is continuing at the Kofa Restoration Center in Paju. And the film itself still continues to be screened at film festivals. It's screened at the Seoul Women's Film Festival, and recently it was filmed at it was screened at the Under the Bridge Film Festival in 2019, where audiences both young and old could enjoy the film on a large screen next to the Han River. So I would like to leave you with a quote from director Park Chan-wook's autobiography, because I think it's an extremely powerful quote. While making The Widow, the proverb, "A person who walks 100 li should think of the remaining 99 li as half of the struggle," came to mind. With my personality, I could never do just half of 99 li, so I gritted my teeth in determination, as I simply could not fail. What a wonderful quote that is, and it really describes just how determined, just how focused director Park Chan-wook was in making The Widow and becoming Korea's first female filmmaker. And in doing so, she helped to pave the way for all of the other female filmmakers who came after her. So thank you everyone for listening. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and take care and stay safe.